Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for joining us at Foresight and BLG's webinar on M&A Preparedness. Now, I don't personally have many words I live by, but if I did, the ones I wished I lived by was start with the end in mind. And I think that's really the thing we'd like to dig into on this chat here with some folks from our friends at BLG is what does an M&A look like, feel like, how can you think about it and prepare for it? If you start with the end in mind, you'll take the right steps along the way. You'll hopefully get there sooner, and it'll hopefully be a smoother process when you arrive. I think while the last few people come in, I will mention that it is always with gratitude and respect that we recognize that the lands on which Foresight operates are traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people of Canada. Myself, I'm presenting from the lands of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations in Vancouver, BC, and I encourage everybody, as always, to understand the lands on which they are operating in Canada. We'll do a little welcome. That's what we're working through right now. I'm going to let you know the fine folks we have from BLG. You might notice a couple of them have a standardized background for office furniture, but we'll also call them out. Then we'll jump into a round table discussion. I will allow them to answer some questions that I have that frame it. As always, I'm interested in your questions on this topic, so do feel free to jump in the chat box. If you haven't already, I see somebody posting already. That's Astrid saying good day to you all. That's where if you want to jump in and post your questions, I'll make sure to ask that of them. It's also a fairly small, intimate group, so feel free to unmute yourself and jump in after raising your hand, and we can sort of continue any conversation on a specific topic. We're then going to, depending on how many people show up, go through maybe some breakout rooms. We'll see. We might just all stay together. What I'd love to do is have an opportunity to sort of have you all introduce yourselves to the folks at BLG and have them answer some more specific questions that are maybe related to what you're doing or area of interest. That's how we're going to spend the next 85 minutes. I've already gone through 5 of them. Without any further ado, let's get into the fun of talking about what is Foresight. Hopefully all of you know it if you're here, but we are a not-for-profit. We're Canada's largest clean tech accelerator, and our goal is to rapidly launch, commercialize, and scale climate solutions. We do this primarily by working with what we think of as the Helix 5, or our partners, the innovators we obviously work through our accelerator programs, the industry partners that we have in our challenges, investors, government, and academia form the rest of that group that are so important to moving technologies from ideas into global scale solutions. So very, very happy to have them as partners. I will now turn it over to Melinda Park, maybe to talk a little bit about BLG. I don't want to introduce you guys, and get anything wrong here. So please take it away.
Okay, heaven forbid you get it wrong. Thank you very much, Stephen, for joining us and participating with us and allowing BLG to be part of this really fun 85 minutes that's about to come forward. And thank you to everybody who's joining us today. I hope that there's a bit of insight that we provide, a statement or two that you find intriguing or that you want to know more about, or even as you leave this meeting today, you will find something that you think you can apply to whatever it is that the next stage of your company is about. BLG is very proud to be part of this. BLG is, depending on the given day, the largest law firm in Canada. The numbers fluctuate sometimes, and we are a full service law firm. And what that means is it is intriguing because we can take our clients from the beginning through midlife in the business cycle, help them exit. We've got litigation when perhaps the exit isn't as happy as everybody wanted. And more importantly, it also covers various places throughout Canada. So our insights are not just regional, our insights are national. We have a flavor that is perhaps more unique because we can understand where the Quebec ideas are coming from, what is challenging in BC, or where things should be going. We are also identifying ourselves as Canada's law firm, which means we are Canadian. We do not have offices outside of our borders. It also means we are experts in Canadian law, and we are experts in understanding what it is that Canadians and international individuals wanting to come to Canada are looking for. So as you can see on the screen, we have 5 offices, as I mentioned, from all areas of Canada except for the Maritimes. We have, wow, 1,000+ legal professionals. I'm reading that and I'm so excited to even see that myself. And that includes professionals who are over and above the lawyers who are there. So that's just a little bit about us. We are old in history, but we are 22 years old as a national firm. So we bring with us the, I think over 100 years with some of the individual firms, and then we came together in the year 2000. So you get a lot of history as well as you get a lot of the new ideas, because just like we're talking about, our law firms did a merger when we came together. So we walked the walk, so we actually understand a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. So that's BLG in a nutshell, Stephen.
Awesome. Thank you very much. A wonderful overview. And I love the focus in the middle diagram of the 1,000 legal professionals. Clearly a focus on diversity there. I think there's just about as many women as men in that diagram. So hopefully that's representing the firm as a whole. We do have, as I mentioned, multiple people from your company. Obviously yourself. We've also got Scott Robson and Melissa Smith. Melinda, since you were already speaking, I will let you take a breather, and I will maybe ask Melissa to introduce herself.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you, and welcome everyone. My name is Melissa Smith. I'm a partner here at BLG, and I'm the regional group manager for the business group in the Calgary office. I've been with the firm since I started out, so I articled at BLG and have been here ever since, so I'm a lifer. I practice in both securities capital markets, which is the public company space, as well as private company M&A and finance, and have my whole career. Certainly the industries I've practiced in have kind of changed over the years. I think like many people in Calgary in the early 2000s when I started out, did a lot of energy and energy sort of adjacent type work. That's been a big shift in, I think, the city, but my practice as well, to focus a lot more on tech, and in particular, working in clean tech, as well as I do some fintech as well and some digital asset work. I have a 13-year-old daughter, and I'm very proud to be part of BLG's Driven by Women initiative, which is a national initiative we have here to support and work with women-led businesses at all levels, but a lot of startup and a lot of tech as well in that space. And maybe that, can I turn it over to Scott?
Hey everyone, Scott Robson. I'm also a partner in our business and capital markets group. Very similar to Melissa in terms of the makeup of my practice. So probably about 50% is public company work, 50% private company work. I have a real big passion kind of for the current Alberta tech scene, and I'm trying to be as involved in that as possible, because I think there's amazing things happening right now in Alberta and some amazing growth happening. So certainly involved with all the things that are happening in that space as well. Like Melissa, I actually have a newborn child, and I'm just very excited to be here and chat with you guys today. I've done some work in the clean tech space, have actually been involved with attempting to list a clean tech company on the Oslo Stock Exchange. So have been there and seen it, and looking forward to chatting.
Fantastic, Scott. We'll have to dig into why the Oslo Stock Exchange, but it's great to hear that good work there. And Melinda, last but in no way least, you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Sure, thanks. So I am the lawyer at the table who's been doing this the longest, and I joined BLG in 2002. So not only did our law firm, as I mentioned, become BLG as part of a merger, I then became part of BLG through a subsequent merger when my firm, of which I was a partner, joined BLG. So I really have walked the walk in this one. I sometimes get questions, so I've been doing this for a while, and I sometimes get questions as to why am I still doing this Is it not the same thing? Are you not bored? Aren't you interested in doing something else? And when I answer those questions honestly rather than flippantly, I really need to say it's because I do what I do and I love the clients and I love being part of the team that advances the companies and the vision that the companies have. So when we have our guests here today, that's really where you are at. And it's something that I've had the privilege of being at for almost 30 years now. So being at the board table, understanding the entrepreneurial spirit, being there in good times and bad. We have seen companies be wildly successful. We have seen companies have wonderful ideas and just not be able to get them to where they thought they could be. So sometimes it's very happy, sometimes it's not. But when you're involved in the merger and acquisition space, many, many times you're at the closing table when hands are being shaken and the champagne is being popped, and it's a really vibrant and exciting place to be. And to be at the board table when you are sitting there and making the decisions is really a very privileged place to be. And it's why I still do this after the years that I do. My entire practice has been in Calgary, and I think Alberta is one of the most entrepreneurial places in Canada, and perhaps even in North America. So I love the vibe that's here, and I like the way entrepreneurs come together. I like the way we can strategize and be creative, and so it's why I still do what I do, and hopefully get to talk a little bit more about what we do through this next 75 minutes.
All right, fantastic, Melinda. And I'm just on the left side of the Rockies, so them's fighting's words. I think we've got some fantastic entrepreneurs out here and a real good spirit to us. For those of you who don't know,
and I'm from Saskatchewan, so I can't even say I was born here. So all those words have just been, created. They were not from blood.
Fantastic. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen because I think this is more about a conversation with the folks we have here. If you don't know who I am, I'm Steve Wilson, the VP of Acceleration at Foresight, and I'm not a lawyer. And I used to work in startups, and I never went through an M&A on that side of the table. So I'm going to bring all the wonderful ignorance that I have to try and ask you some really great questions. I'm going to kick it off with the first one. What is it that you mean when you say merger acquisitions? What kind of shapes can they take? What kind of different flavors are there? I mean, lots of, I often think of the Foresight prototypical client as somebody who's got a PhD in chemistry, right? Someone who isn't really well versed in business. And so how would you kind of describe the options and the colors and the flavors that M&As can come in? And I'm going to start off by asking, I'll go with Scott. How do you sort of think of that?
Yeah, so I would say, what is M&A? M&A at its basic level is basically sort of a consolidation of companies, or a coming together of companies and assets. It can take, there can be different ways that happens. So, you have obviously in M&A right in the word merger and acquisition, you have a merger where two companies come together and form, often a new legal entity, and then that's a go forward entity, and that has its own political considerations and various considerations that are specific to that type of structure. And then you have something different, which is an acquisition, and usually that's a complete takeover of a company, and oftentimes you'll see prior management will drop off and a new management on a go forward basis. So they are kind of two different things, but I mean in essence kind of the same. There's a number of different structures by which that can happen. So one of those structures is, I'm sure we've all heard of something called a share purchase. And so that's where you actually buy the stock of a company from the existing owners. And that type of structure has certain legal considerations and things that the purchaser and the seller should think about. Another form is something called an asset purchase. And that's a situation where one of the operating companies is actually just selling some or all of its assets to another company directly. So it's not there's no moving of stock, that stays the same. It's all down at the operating co level. And so again, that will have various other considerations, legal and otherwise, that will need to be thought about before that type of structure is implemented. A third form, you could say, is something called an amalgamation. And that would be sort of that merger concept I talked about, where two companies come together, form a new legal entity, and they go forward. A fourth form is something called a plan of arrangement. So that would be a situation where you have potentially foreign shareholders. That's often what drives it, and you get a court involved, and the court sort of structures it. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to sort of achieve these outcomes, and a lot of that will all depend on what the parties are looking to achieve, and things such as tax considerations and other considerations that are relevant to the parties.
So there's not necessarily one is better than the other. It's just that they're appropriate in different spaces. And, for an innovator, you're looking at like, do you want to buy my IP, or do you want to buy the plants that I've built versus do you want to buy the whole company, which would probably mean you're taking all the staff and all that good stuff versus the planned arrangement, which, would be the foreign entities, versus the merger, which is maybe there's some value created in a new entity for both kind of groups. Is that kind of a fair summary? Just kind of depends really on.
Absolutely, you got it. That's a perfect summary. So for instance, with an asset purchase, the beauty of that is you can cherry pick certain assets. So like you said, if a company, maybe it's a stinky company because it has a lot of litigation, but the target company has fantastic IP. So you as a purchaser can go in there and you can pick out the IP and leave the existing owners with the stinky litigation, and that's exactly that. It depends on the circumstances, and there's a whole bunch of fantastic considerations you need to think about, but the different structures accommodate those different considerations.
Okay.
I might just add, sorry, Stephen, there's sort of tax consequences to the different structures as well. So when you're deciding how to move forward, I think Scott's already mentioned, litigation might be a consideration, or liabilities, but tax advice early on is always very recommended, because it can really affect the purchase price if the tax bill is really different.
Right. And so you mentioned, yes, Melinda.
Go on, because I think this will then set the framework for how we talk about the rest. It is so important that you understand what the synergies actually are, and that the parties who are negotiating agree on what those synergies can be. We have seen in the past circumstances where parties come together, they finally introduce lawyers like us to the table, and we start listening to them, and we see that they're kind of going like this, and they're not really aligned in what it is that they want to achieve with this merger and acquisition. And so counsel can be good at forcing you to have those tough conversations right at the beginning. And a really good example is you have two very strong CEOs sitting at the table. Nobody said it. Each of them think they're taking on the ongoing CEO role. And how difficult is that conversation after you've already started to execute documents? Or in some cases, people think, well, you're bringing the injection of another $3 million. Well, I didn't think that was my obligation. Or what it is that we're doing. What is the synergy that you actually think this combined or this negotiated coming together is going to provide? And are you prepared for what the consequences of that are? So when we continue talking about all of this, and when we talk about the different structures, and we talk about the different consequences, the emotional consequence and the go forward consequence, because I'm sure everybody that's here on this call, you are very deeply invested in what it is that you have created. So make sure you are aligned with what it is you think the synergies are.
Right. And the value will continue to kind of grow, and you're doing it for the right reasons. So with those kind of potential ends, the asset purchase, the share purchase, the merger amalgamation plan, you mentioned litigation, and you want to avoid that. That's going to make it complicated. That's going to reduce the number of options you have just down to the asset purchase. What are some other things that people should be thinking about as they build their business towards that, so that when there is a discussion of synergy and value that's created by an acquiring company or merging company, what are some other things that they should go through, to keep in mind as they're building that business? Melissa, do you have sort of some thoughts of, besides avoiding litigation, which is probably, an obvious one?
I guess managing litigation might be a better way to say it. You can't help. There's always, an employee who's usually for wrongful dismissal or something, so you can't always avoid it, but make sure you're on top of it and managing it. I think one of the most important things for me is setting up your capital structure right from the beginning correctly. So making sure you have a share structure that is not overly complicated, that does not have insane terms in it. I know when you're raising money at the beginning, I think there's a bit of a, I need the money, I'll agree to the terms, but those terms live with you for a very long time and can make a future sale problematic. So just being conscious, if the goal is to create a business that you are then one day going to sell or do an M&A transaction with, you have to be cognizant of that share structure all the way through. It's incredible. You can't really change it without consent later on. So if you're creating a shareholder who has a ton of power, they will always have a ton of power and they will then have a big voice in your sale. And you just have to be cognizant of that. I would say another one I see is just be careful with stock options. People do give them out a lot, I think, at the beginning because it's sometimes a bonus if you can't pay a lot of cash. But again, just be aware of your capital structure. I'm not saying don't do stock options, but be aware of them. Those people are going to be your shareholders. Consider if you need an agreement in place to buy those back if they leave your company as a disgruntled employee, so you don't have a shareholder sitting at the table who is unhappy with you. So things like that, just being very cognizant and aware of your capital structure and just really understanding the true cost of it. I know sometimes people get into things like safes, which is obviously a good tool, but at the same time, really, really understand what the waterfall looks like on those, what that's going to look like with financing. If your valuations aren't quite what you thought they were at the time, how does that affect that? And just never take your eye off that. Always have a really good sense of your capital structure and the cost of your capital. Maybe so it's not just me, I can maybe turn it over. I don't know, Melinda, if you want to add as well.
Yeah, and I'll just piggyback on that, which is what Melissa said is, bar none, one of the biggest roadblocks we see. The second roadblock that's tied to what she just said is make sure that it's papered properly. People usually don't fight about stuff until there's value. And again, anecdotally, we have seen circumstances where companies are now ready to be attractive to be acquired or are large enough or significant enough that they can be part of a merger or an acquisition. And now what happens is George comes in and says, well, you promised me stock options. Like the only reason I've been here for 2 years is because I was getting stock options. And you're going, well, they aren't papered properly. Or we've seen this many times. Well, the CEO promised me 5% of the company because I helped them with their website design. Oh, the CFO was really just working out of the garage. So I'm sure he's supposed to have like 15% of the company, but I'm not really sure. And now we're at a stage where there is attraction and interest, and we are fighting, hopefully not, but probably, and papering what it is that the securities are and ownership and percentage ownership of control are all about. And we're doing it on our heels rather than properly documenting it at the time. So as Melissa says, it's not just important because you need to know the consequences of how the money's coming in and what those are. You need to make sure you papered it properly so that nobody's coming out of the woodwork later saying, I believe I have an interest because you promised me X, Y, or Z. Really, really important. And I know often you're running 100 miles an hour. You don't yet have counsel involved. You're doing this on a shoestring, both from your just the quantity of time that you have. You're running your company as well as you're trying to paper things, as well as you're trying to do all of the boring stuff that lawyers tend to do. But if you don't do it and you are successful, it will come back and bite you. Memories will be very different. What is it the statement is? There is a difference in our recollection, or we are understanding things differently. You don't want that when you have opportunities at your door.
And just to build on that and tying into Melissa's point there, like I think the end goal is everybody wants to build a successful company that has value that can be sold for a good price, and you come away with a fantastic exit. But the problem is with some of these early stage financing structures, if done incorrectly, it can actually make it impossible to achieve that end goal. And I'm thinking just a practical example is a company I was dealing with just the other day. They're kind of mid-stage, but very early on, they implemented a very onerous set of shareholder approval rights and things like that, so they could get just a little bit of money early on. But long term, it has really made it difficult for them to grow their business at an appropriate rate, because they're having tough times just even going and getting like non-dilutive financing, because there's so many approval requirements and so much red tape they have to go through to do even the simplest of things. So just something to really think of, like that's a practical example of what can happen if you don't think about these things early on.
And maybe I just to throw one more out there is just I want to talk briefly about board governance. So just thinking early on who your board of directors should be is helpful as well. I think at the beginning, people want to keep it tight. They don't want outsiders in their business, but having someone who knows your industry, who's been through the life cycle of a company before, who is independent and perhaps it has a bit clearer vision that's not clouded with any sort of personal attachment to the company is really helpful. So just being thoughtful about who you'd like to have on your board of directors and truly considering bringing in some, we call them independent, so non-executive officer type individuals, and they can help really in a mentor, even an informal mentorship role, and they will be invaluable if you go to look for a deal, because depending on the deal, you might actually need to go to a place where you're getting your independent directors to evaluate the deal separately. That just comes from a conflict of interest. If you're the CEO of a company and you're either going to be CEO of the go forward entity, which is a benefit to you, or you're going to get a lovely severance package, which is a benefit to you, you're considered to be a bit conflicted. So you often remove yourself from the decision. So having that board as early as possible with mentors, with people who have seen the life cycle of a business can just be invaluable as well.
Okay. So I just want to slow down here for a second. You're telling me all these wonderful little groups of people, because I see all these early stage companies making wonderful promises, trying really hard, and doing it on the best of intentions. Those intentions sometimes fall apart. Like you have to have good fences to make good neighbors. That's what you're telling me here. All that goodwill I see in my programs, it's not gonna pan out. These people are gonna end up fighting.
We tell people you only do a unanimous shareholders agreement when you are in love with each other, which is when everybody says, oh, we don't need one. We're all good. We're totally aligned. We know exactly where we want to go as a company. We'll do that when we're bigger. 100%. I preach from the pulpit. You do a unanimous shareholders agreement when you love each other, because by the time you don't love each other, it's too late. So yes, all good intentions need to be papered properly.
Always think an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Awesome. I mean, though that seems like, and because I'll be totally honest, I'm the person who's always pushing these companies to like call customers, right? Like the one thing that kills more companies than anything else means there won't be any value for anybody to acquire is if they don't understand what the customer needs. So I'm the devil on their shoulder, sort of saying like, yeah, leave the papering of things till later. Like just figure out what the customer needs. What are some, practical small steps? You sort of said like, there's lots of things that you can get lawyers to do in counsel, but that's generally later on. We've got a little bit more budget to make all these things well and find the board of governance. I mean, are there some simple steps? You sort of mentioned the unanimous shareholders agreement. Are there a couple things that they absolutely have to have at this stage? Besides not making promises to people of 5% of ownership verbally or through email, what are some things that they can avoid? Like, is it just clear employment contracts and a shareholders agreement, or like what are a couple things that are just, you got to have these basics, and then we can kind of look at some other pieces later? Is it just a minute book? Is it like, what are some of the basics they have to be doing?
I'd say minute book.
Sorry, I think one of the things you can do just off the left side of your desk is you keep a little spreadsheet, because if you are working quickly, if you are going into financing rounds, if you are looking for that initial amount of capital, if you are trying to bring somebody and you can't pay them too much, always have a spreadsheet that runs through your percentage ownership. And when you're doing your different series of shares, perhaps, George is going to get a Class B, but what does that really mean? Keep all of that, because you'll never remember. Because Stephen, I know you're saying, is it good to have a minute book? A minute book is like saying, it's good to pay attention to your taxes. The devil's in the detail. A minute book is the accumulation of all the documents that you need to do throughout the year, and as you do financings and as you make big decisions. So that's not just it just happens and it's just a couple of things. And it can only be based on the facts that actually exist. So your minute book is going to be woefully out of date if, for example, you didn't keep that spreadsheet and you forgot that you gave Stephen 5% in stock options, or you forgot, that George was getting this other class of shares. So I think if you keep that on the left side of your desk, it really grounds you to, Melinda understands when Stephen got that, her percentage went from 90 to 87 and from 87 to 80. And when I brought in Frank as the CFO and he now has 40% of what's left, I'm now down. Like, people sometimes don't understand the very simplistic consequences of a calculation. When you change the denominator or you change the numerator, well, how does that actually impact me? And if you keep that there, very, very simply, if there's one thing you can do, you're always live to the fact as to when does it no longer become relevant for me to run this company.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the CEO's job. That's just absolutely something the CEO has to be doing on an ongoing basis, and be aware of these things and be able to answer people's questions and communicate it to them clearly, both new money and the folks that have already kind of put in either sweat equity or investment. That's just a clear job of theirs. I think that's a great tip for people, just to be clear on where they stand with all the individuals and have their record, and that they can point to of this is what's been committed to, and make sure that they're matching that with actuality. A quick thing that I run into, and I run into this across, not just M&As, but working with engineering companies, talking in the programs that we run, people are sometimes afraid of opening up the kimono, of sort of getting to know a potential business partner. And obviously an M&A is ultimately a business transaction. How do you sort of see people protect themselves for those steps? What would you recommend? And at some point you have to show them everything so that they can actually do the due diligence and come to that valuation and agree on pricing and go to the go forward stages. What's appropriate at different stages, and how do you counsel people to manage that kind of process, right? Because you don't want them to be too afraid and never show anything, and then the deal doesn't go anywhere, but you don't want them to provide too much information and reveal trade secrets and give away the value of the company before it's actually paid for, right?
I'll take that, Scott.
Sure. Yeah. Sure. I think the number one thing a company can do is get a quality non-disclosure agreement in place. That's going to be probably, in any of these transactions, that's going to be one of your starting points. And so that's basically an agreement that you enter into with the other party to the M&A transaction that says, hey, other party, if you start sniffing around my IP or start looking at my assets and customer lists and stuff like that, you are not going to go and then turn around and use that for your benefit without me knowing, or sell that or steal it, basically. So sometimes when funds are tight and people are operating quick, they'll just pull one of these off of Google and think that's good enough. But I mean, really, this goes to the essence of your business. So you should really consider engaging competent legal counsel to have a review of this. And I mean, there's always people tend to say, okay, well, I've got it done once, that'll apply to all transactions. Well, sometimes the NDA needs to be modified depending. So maybe you're doing multiple M&A transactions, you should really be revisiting that NDA. You shouldn't just rely on a form. You should revisit it each time for each M&A transaction. So they're a very important document, and certainly something that any business thinking about this type of transaction should have. The other thing that I think a company could always consider is kind of a staged release. Like you say, opening up the kimono, you're not, Coca-Cola doesn't reveal its recipe the second it starts talking to a party about a sale, right? So you could stage the release of your most valuable crown jewels and not give those over to the other side to start looking at until you guys have got further down the road in the process. So those are some ways you can kind of have the conversations and be a part of the dance, but not fully kind of expose your company.
Okay, fantastic. Melissa, Melinda, anything to add?
No, I was going to, it's less about M&A. Just, you had talked about having employment agreements and contractor agreements. Very important to have it in place, obviously, for an M&A transaction. A purchaser is going to want to see those, but just for the life of your business, good place to have confidentiality provisions, good place to have waiver of IP rights, assignment of IP rights. So really, you need to have written agreements there from the beginning with employees and contractors, or else you're risking your confidential information, your IP. And if that's what the value of your company is, obviously that would affect an exit if you've not covered your bases there.
I can say we're in the middle of trying to get a purchase agreement signed right now. And in the due diligence process, we are going to be a larger acquirer, so it's not quite a merger and acquisition. And the biggest concern right now is that the existing employment agreements that the private company has, there's a very big question mark as to who owns the IP. And it is enough to press pause on how it is that we're going to sign our agreements, and adding a condition that each employee now has to sign additional and ancillary agreements, which, of course, even if you only have 10 employees, now you're telling them all, even if you're not ready to. And you have, so those agreements, Melissa, that's a really, really good point, because when other companies are starting to do their due diligence on you, often they look to the paper, and that's a really important one on ownership that you wouldn't think, right? Who thinks employment agreements are part of the ownership structure of the assets?
But they are.
But they are.
So we've come from kind of, what do you got to do at the beginning, at the start? You got to keep the little cap table on the side of your desk. You now we're talking a little bit about the IP and getting close to that merger event. What are some things companies need to think about as they're getting ready? If they're sort of saying, now we've built the value, now we've got the customers, now we've done all the research and the thing works, and now I need somebody to buy it off of me. What do they need to do to get that package ready, as they're sort of saying, like, now we want to explore this space, or now we're thinking that this is the route we want to take? Are there specific steps or things that they should be considering at that stage?
Financial statements. Very, very important, Stephen, to have early on your books and records in a way that can facilitate prompt and good financial statements, even if they're not going to be audited. Anybody looking at value, anybody confirming your share issuances, anybody confirming, your debt structure, anybody confirming potential litigation, or that's you've already put in as contingent. Your financial statements now become one of the key prepared documents, and almost everybody will not accept just management prepared financials. There needs to be some level of independence, whether it's review, so negative assurance from an auditing firm or an accountant, or your full-on audits. And I think as you progress through your financing tools, and especially if you start interacting with private equity or banks, you're probably going to have to deliver those financial statements anyway. But you mentioned a little while ago minute books. We've talked about documents. All of those, if they are in place, then assist your auditors coming in to prepare the financial statements. If you have a good internal team, even your management prepared financial statements are not so far out of IFRS, even if it's private company accounting, that it's consistent, then you can roll them over quickly. We've had many examples where we've been told, no, don't worry, we're really good, we're up to date in our financials. so far away from GAAP, like so far away from IFRS, that the auditors just go, well, we're starting from scratch. And worse, everything you were telling the other sides about value and structure and you know, where things were sitting in both your, I'm going to use old words, your balance sheet and your, you know, some of them are deriving income, but where is that coming from? Or your cash flow statements. When those start to be moving around, you again lose the comfort that you probably were already building up. So very, very important.
Okay.
And just to build on that, in that same vein, and selfish plug, because we are professional advisors, but you should start really thinking about who those professional advisors are going to be. M&A transactions involve a ton of them, not just legal, but on the accounting side. So you should be, if you see M&A on the horizon, you should be engaging your accountants early and saying, hey, guys, do a scrub of our books here. What are we missing, and how can we make this look good so that we can present it to a potential suitor? So you need to be assembling your professional team sooner rather than later. There's bankers that are involved. There are a whole host, depending, potential specialists depending on industry and whatnot. So you really need to think about that early on.
Can I layer one more on, or?
Yeah, dive in, Melissa.
I was going to say you should probably also review your key contracts. So if you have key suppliers, key licensing agreements, key any type of agreement you have that really go to the heart of your business, start looking at them and just make sure that they're assignable, they're transferable. What kind of consent do you need to have? How hard do you think it's going to be to get that consent? And just start thinking about those third parties that are going to have to get involved at some point. Sometimes that can go to how you structure it. So for example, some contracts say you can't assign it, but they don't say anything about a change of control of your company. So in that case, it's really keen. You don't think the third party is going to play ball, or they're just too big to pay any attention. You might just do a share deal. But just going through that and understanding that, what consents do you need? What notifications do you need? Think about, when would I have to let this person know, and would that affect our relationship? So just start turning your mind to sort of those pieces sooner rather than later, because that's going to help you determine structure and understand timing as well moving forward. If you need a third party consent, or God forbid a government consent, you just add months to the process to try to get that. So understanding that's helpful.
Melissa, and I'm glad you brought up timing and relationships. I proposed to my wife. She said yes. It took us a year to actually get married. So I knew the relationship I wanted with the other party that I wanted. The legal thing wasn't the real holdup. It was all the other pieces of it. What's the and we might temper some expectations here. What's the fastest you've ever seen one of these deals go through? And what's the slowest? I'm gonna start with you, Melissa, and then we'll go around the room real quickly for some.
If you did a deal in 60 days, that would be fast. I think 45 to 60 days is a fast deal. Most of the time it's months. Like if you're talking about from when you start talking and start those negotiations, I mean, longest deal, God, I have some that probably are on years now. I don't know if they'll ever go, but it takes a long time. The due diligence process alone, depending on how much staff you have and can throw resources at responding to due diligence requests and doing that piece of it, can be months on its own. So gosh, I don't know if I have a typical time, but I'd say 3 months is probably realistic. 6 months if it's going to take a while to organize your documents for a due diligence process, or if there's those outstanding third-party consents.
Scott, sound about right?
Yeah, that's in the wheelhouse. I think also some of it depends on the size of the deal. What is it that, it goes back to our early conversation on what is it that you're buying and what are you doing. If it's you're just buying a little asset, you can actually do that pretty quick. 25 days, something like 20 days to negotiate the whole thing. But if it's a full-on takeover of another company, yeah, Melissa's right. It's usually a couple months before you're closing that. In an ideal world, usually it starts spilling a little bit. 3-4 months is more typical.
And
yeah, to go back, Stephen, it all depends on what we talked about at the beginning. What are the synergies? And if one of the synergies that is intended is that together you will find it easier to access capital than separately. And one of the reasons you want to come together is because you believe additional financing will be there, an additional investment, a grant, a private equity firm or somebody. They are now bolting on, even though it's ancillary, it's key to even closing your transaction together. So again, when you go back to what your synergies are and you're layering those types of thoughts into it, like we're coming together, we want more capital, this is why we think we can get it, that could lengthen the time frame because somebody else is doing due diligence, somebody else is, you know, considering how much money, whatever it is, they're also negotiating what it is that they want. So knowing what those synergies are upfront is useful, but it can also lengthen the period of time. That's valuable.
And then absolutely, and then the during that time, during that, you know, maybe 25, 30, 60, 90, 6 months, multiple years, the commitment from the executive team is obviously quite intense. So it's actually taking them a lot out of the business of running it and growing, and more just entertaining this examination or this relationship. Is that fair to say? Do you sort of see, or do you see people kind of go and some people can run it off the side of their desk and nobody notices that they're entertaining an M&A?
No, it's awful. And we tell everybody once they start the process, you're going to hate it. All you want to do is run your business, and all the lawyers and the other parties are going to tell you is, we need your attention on this, we need your attention on this. And we can only say, as hard as it is, you have to pay attention to the M&A. And for a point in time, you have to stand still, because if you are always adding accretive value in the process, you're not going to get credit for it. It's going to open up additional due diligence. It's going to change the scope of the synergies that we talked. And the longer it takes, because you're doing business, and as you said, Stephen, just doing the M&A deal off the corner of your desk, obviously that means it takes 5 days to respond to a request rather than 5 hours to respond to it. So you can either lose the attention of the other party, or it just gets so horrifically bogged down that your business starts to suffer too, because you're not doing either one well.
I think it's important to think about your internal team. So when you go into the process, like who's going to know? I'll use your wedding example. Like, you have to be careful not to tell all your friends before you tell your parents, so their feelings are going to get really hurt. But it's the same in a business. You don't want all your employees to know. You don't know if the deal is going to go through or not. You don't want them distracted with it if it doesn't close in the end. And obviously they'll have all their personal considerations about their jobs. So you have to really assemble a team. It's got to be people you trust. To be honest, a number of businesses in the private business, I've seen them fail on their first M&A attempt. And it's because, like, truthfully, they just can't get their stuff together, often financials. So you have a purchaser coming in saying, I want this report, I want this report, I want this report. And they can't get them in a timely manner. They can't get them in the form the guys want. And then the purchaser's thinking, is there a problem here? Are you just disorganized? Why can't this happen? Or then they're using it as an excuse, frankly, to grind on price. So I've seen that a lot, where it sort of fails on the first time. So the more organized you can be, the better your team is to get that information and respond to those due diligence requests, the better. You know, if you can do it as you go along, whenever we do a deal now, we have something called a data site. So you upload all your company's documents onto your data site. Nobody anymore goes into back rooms and combs through the files. But so if you are organized during the life cycle of your business, and you have a central secure area where you're uploading every employment contract, every supplier contract, every share issuance document, that will really help when it comes to do this. If you already have organized documents in a centralized place, it will save a lot of time. But you do need to have an internal team who can dedicate time to gathering that information and doing that piece of it, or else it will fail, and or the purchaser will use the delays and the inability to provide them with the information as an excuse to grind on purchase price. I've seen that so many times.
And just to that point, the delay costs money. You know, it is expensive, and particularly if the delay costs the transaction, then you've now incurred all these expenses with accountants and whatnot, and going through this process, and your deal is not done. So again, yeah, the more prepared you can be, it saves you money, and it makes just the whole process a lot easier.
So I think that's a very good point. And I guess, the length of time and then the actual, I'll call it a batting average, but not everybody marries their high school sweetheart there, Melissa, is what you're mentioning. It doesn't always go through on the first time. You might need to do the dance with multiple partners. Does anybody have a rough batting average for like the number of due diligence that are started in the M&A space versus those that actually close? And if
I
not,
have a number. Geez.
that's, is it, do you sort of see half? Is a rough feel of?
I think from a lawyer's perspective, because we are often brought in a little later, our anecdotal information is probably higher than it is in the real world, which is before the lawyers get involved, because often we're not even introduced until there's some semblance of certainty. But I would doubt it's 50%. I don't think it's as high as 50%.
I was going to say, if you go off like how many NDAs you sign before you actually sell your company, I'm sure you sign dozens before the deal actually hits.
Yeah, I think it depends on what stage you get. Like, if you get to the LOI stage, I think at that point it might actually be higher than 50%. But if it's just, hey, here's an NDA, let's sign it, and you can snoop around in my preliminary data room, I would suspect, much below 50%.
And then out of curiosity, how different is a data room for an M&A than for other kind of financing rounds? Is it pretty, I've sort of heard you mention some documents and some things that, we talk about if you're just raising the money. Is it fairly similar to what you see in investment rounds? Is that, so if they've kind of raised a seed and a Series A, they've pretty much know what they should be asked to prepare, or is it somewhat different documents? Melissa, you sort of mentioned that sometimes the financials are requested in different formats, or is that a good prep to what they would have to go through in that due diligence?
I think it's a good prep, and I think it's going to be similar, and the structure is going to be similar. Might be more comprehensive in an M&A, especially if they're buying your whole company. They're literally going to want to see every single thing ever done in your company. So probably more comprehensive, but similar structure, certainly, and similar types of information, just maybe more comprehensive for M&A.
Yeah, I see a lot of companies that have kept just kind of and I think Melissa was mentioning it, like an ongoing data room, and they've used that data room for various financing rounds, and then they just build on it for any M&A transaction they're doing. So I think that's becoming, at least in the past kind of 4 or 5 years, that's becoming a more common thing that you see, where there's just this repository of your company documents that are always there and accessible.
Right. And it's just about, cleanliness is next to godliness. As long as you're keeping that cap table up to date, as long as you're putting all your contracts in there, as long as your employment contracts are nice and clean and up to date, and supplier contracts and all the other ones, then it should be a less onerous process to kind of get ready for the dance.
Yeah.
Right, like Melissa said, there might be different types of documents. So one group may want a cash flow statement prepared in a different way, or projections done in a different way, quarterly, monthly, whatever. When that's one of the few requests that's different, it's easy for the CEO, CFO, and a small team to manage. But when you don't have any of the other documents prepared or in a place that has been kept up to date, that one other request for remodeling your cash flow projections is like, well, that's going to be another 3 weeks, because we don't even have our historic cash flow statement done, let alone projections and all those types of things. So again, being prepared means that when somebody asks for something that's slightly different, it's not in addition to everything else that you're trying to get done at the same time. It's just one unique thing that you can deal with discreetly.
Absolutely. Really quickly, before I jump into some more interaction with the audience, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned, maybe even the LOI stage, not everything kind of goes through. What are some of the landmines that people can avoid that sort of scupper deals that cause those things to go off the rails? And I know we sort of jokingly referred to some awful litigation that makes companies unattractive. Are there other things that kind of crop up that if people can avoid, it will give them that better chance of making it through the due diligence?
Say, have the hard conversations up front. Do not kick it down the road. If you know there is a sore point, whether it's who's going to be the CEO of our company, or geez, I have this like litigation or I have a major shareholder who's not that friendly. I don't know if he's going to approve this deal. Like, just have those conversations up front. Do not have those conversations after you've already spent a ton on legal and accounting and a ton of your energy on getting your due diligence done. If it's going to blow up a deal, figure it out at the beginning and don't waste the money and the time going forward with all the advisors. That'd be my biggest tip. And what I see blow up is just issues that people knew about. They knew about them, but they just never talked about it. They just kept kicking it down the road. And then it blows up as you're trying to close a deal and you've already invested so much time and energy.
Yeah, I think as a practical example of that, I saw one company where there was they were having some potentially difficult financial, or they were facing a difficult financial situation. They knew about it when they commenced the M&A negotiations, but from what I understand, were insistent on not actually revealing it until later on in the process, thinking that that would be a good thing, but ended up just blowing up the entire deal. They spent all this money and went through the whole process, and everybody just got cold feet because it was more just the whole negotiation sort of broke down because everybody felt that there was some deception going on and that people weren't honest at the table. And it's kind of what Melinda was talking about at the start, when all the CEOs sit down and understand what they want and what this is going to look like. If you don't kind of have that honesty all the way through, it can really mess things up.
And I think the other party that Melissa alluded to is if you have a big shareholder, they are going to be significantly impacted by how this transaction is structured. And we just had a transaction implode about a month ago, and this is a cross-border issue, this specific one, but the very large shareholder who had been funding the company and its really creative and unique things, and it's getting ready to roll out commercially, was a US resident. And the US resident tax consequences are so bad for this individual, for whatever his tax structure is, it killed the deal. And the reason is he was going to be disposing of his shares just like everybody else, but because he had such a large position, it was like, yeah, this can't happen if he doesn't come on board. And it's not that he was even an ass. It was just that the financial consequence to him was so significant. Threading through all the comments we've had, it wasn't structured properly at the beginning. Nobody was thinking about this might be an exit. Nobody thought about what this individual's consequences were going to be outside of the company's. And we did have an LOI, and the deal got terminated.
So don't just take anybody's money, Melinda. You actually have to think, like, what's the takeaway on that one? Like, I can't just...
Oh, you take his money, but you understand what your exit might be, and you start planning for it a little earlier. And you start conditioning that individual to the fact that he or she, in this case it was a he, could have a tax consequence that cannot hold back the company.
Right. Any questions? Anything we didn't cover? Leonard, you sort of said you were sort of looking at this. Anything to do with governance? I know Melissa mentioned a little bit putting together a board there, getting some independent directors, having that in place to help you out through this piece. Structuring your company, I know that's come up a few times. And I know we mentioned financials and having those clean and pretty and ready a couple times. Were there any specific questions as you're looking at this that you have? Oh, and you're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute.
And I don't believe I have any questions at the moment. I've been making notes, and it seems to be that we've covered a lot of the important bases over time. My business partner Mike, he obviously has had some experience in this department, because just by looking at what we've done here, I think we're on the right track, at least, anyways.
One of the things I wanted to add, and kind of specifically to Leonard, but I think it's useful, is that you can be as creative as you want to or need to. The beautiful thing about small m merger and small a acquisition is it's really groups of people coming together, or one or more groups exiting. So sometimes when we hear stories like Leonard's, and it's a founder through age or illness or just lack of passion wants to exit, there are ways that can happen as well that doesn't require the holus bolus kind of thing that people think about with a merger and acquisition. We sometimes see what are called management buyouts, where people who are minority shareholders and were active in the business raise enough money or buy the shares and have the possibility of a partial exit for the people that for age or health or other reasons need to exit. And it isn't a 100% kind of takeover or move of shares. There can be cash that buys those entities out. So Leonard, I'm using you as the example, but I think that's another M&A structure that sometimes people don't think about and are worried that if they pursue an M&A, they are completely leaving, or everybody's leaving, or their baby is now completely in the hands of somebody else. And you can do them in a partial way that still allows the people that need to either exit or to grow or to leave.
Okay.
Thank you. Andrea, did you kind of have any specific questions as you're sort of looking through that growth? Or Frank, you have a question?
Yeah, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts if there are any regulations in Canada in place in terms of foreign investment restrictions. And of course, particularly, I'm focused on companies in agri-food. Of course, food is an essential commodity to Canada. We want to be careful what we keep control of. Can you talk a little bit to that, please?
Sure.
And maybe the other part in terms of foreign investment, how do you make sure that you end up with the right foreign investors for you and stay away from the wrong ones?
That's a harder one to answer.
It makes it even more interesting, yes.
I'll start and I'll let Melissa and Stephen, Melissa and Scott tag in. Tax structures are very significantly impacted when you lose Canadian control. So that's always one of the things we first mention. And I think it's different if it's one foreign investor who's coming in and isn't going to really direct where things are going. And also when you're looking at the M&A, we have, it's now Finance and Innovation, there's Investment Canada Act, there's submissions you have to make when a foreign acquirer is going to come into an M&A transaction. There are size thresholds, there are levels of approval that you need to take. They're also more particular depending on, as you said, if it's real property, if it's culture. For example, we're working on an e-gaming deal that has significant level of controls, and it's because of the internet age and the access to private information. And so when a foreign company is coming in, we have to make certain filings with the government and those types of things. So very good question that does not have an easy or one size fits all answer, but really important to consider that at the beginning. And as I mentioned, the other example, if you do bring in a foreign shareholder, you need to know that they need to know that you're going to get out and they can't hold you up because of their foreign tax consequence.
Great, thank you.
And I mean, Melinda, I mean, Frank, it's a great question because it's hard enough to know who's a good investor locally, let alone who's a good investor in the foreign context. Melissa or Scott, did you have anything to add to that answer?
No, I would just echo what Melinda said in terms of tax being so critical and something to consider early, because it can kind of directly impact how you might structure the transaction or investment vehicles and the whole kit and caboodle. So as soon as there are foreign investors at the table, it's worth having that conversation very early on, because it can have sort of a waterfall effect on how you do everything.
And foreign partners in your proposed M&A, right? So that's also very important. Is that if you're looking at bringing parties together, even if it's a subsidiary of a larger company, when you're looking at M&A that is not Canadian based, and I think that's an important part as well to consider.
I was just going to say, sort of the specific question regarding the agribusiness. I mean, I think there are some restrictions on foreign ownership. One nice thing about working in a large national law firm is we have people who are experts in everything. So we have a group that does sort of foreign investment trade as their specialty, and the regulations around that. So I don't have the exact rules, but there definitely are restrictions in that area. And if you're talking about actual ownership of rural property, some of the provinces have limitations on that as well for non-residents. So again, you have to be careful of your share structure and make sure your company doesn't somehow become non-resident, or look how you structure that with which subsidiaries. I know, for example, Alberta does. I'm not sure about BC, but certainly Alberta does.
Okay. Allison, you had a question, and you're raising your hand in as many ways as possible. So I want to get to you.
I was actually asking it, and then Melinda mentioned it briefly, but Melinda, you're talking about management buyout, and small companies like ours. I mean, for us, it's more like employee buyout, and I wonder if you had. I mean, maybe there's not a difference. I draw the line being that I don't think our employees who are preferred exit would be to our employees have enough wealth themselves or tolerance for the risk of risking that wealth, given our age discrepancies. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
I mean, there's, again, different ways you can do it. A really intriguing one is almost like a vendor take back. And depending on the purpose of the senior people leaving, if it is they've lost their passion, they want to retire, but they're not in need of the entire amount, you can do like a timed acquisition. So you agree on the price now, you might borrow a certain portion, and then another portion just gets paid out over 5 years. It's kind of a loan coming back and being paid. Depending on how intriguing the interest or how intriguing the business is, you might get places like credit unions or private equity or banks. Private equity is different because what you're actually doing in these types of leveraged buyouts is you're not putting money into the company, you're lending money to the people, and then they're giving that money to the other side who is going to exit. So the dance is slightly different, but there are different ways of doing it. And you can get external capital if they love the business and if they love the people that are staying.
Fantastic. I hadn't thought of those ideas before, but something I would like to speak about further. Thank you.
Sure.
Well, then maybe I have another question here, and it's valuation and having multiple suitors for the same company, and how to manage that properly when people start asking for exclusivity rounds and blocking in or locking out alternative suitors from the conversation. Can you share a bit of thoughts on that? Is like, how do you what advice can you give to founders to make sure that they thought about valuation or the alternative valuations early enough, so that they can have a good, well-founded discussion about and get the price that they deserve?
Maybe I'll jump in. I'm thinking of answering that in sort of two parts. One, the valuation. I mean, I think that goes to, you really need to understand the value of your company. So you do need to, early on, make sure you have a good sense of what the company's worth. People throw around numbers all the time in financings and stuff. If you don't know what the right number is, it's going to be hard to negotiate with the counterparty. So I do think that's something you should always be thinking about and make sure you're aware of. You brought up exclusivity. Most people, when you get to the LOI stage, are going to want exclusivity. So by the time you've signed an LOI, they're saying, we're about to invest a bunch of time and money to do due diligence on your company. So we want some exclusivity there. So we know you're not just, playing us against some, 5 other offers if we're going to actually make this investment. So I do think you probably need to anticipate some requests for exclusivity. Don't give too much though. I see people sign crazy LOIs that have like a 6-month exclusivity. I mean, why would you ever do that? If someone has looked at your company, if they're serious, they should put all hands on deck and come look really hard for 30 days. Or, maybe you agree to 60 in the circumstances, but, you want that to be as short as possible, as tight as possible. If they're serious, they're going to throw a lot at it, and they can do that in a quick period of time. Then you don't need these huge, long exclusivity periods, because you're right, they really limit your options going forward.
And just on the point of getting the best valuation, a lot of companies, when they are thinking seriously about selling or doing an M&A transaction, will engage a deal advisor to go around and shop their deal. And that is one way that you can get the best valuation, because you know it's been out there and it's been with a bunch of different parties. They've looked at it, and you're hopefully getting the best suite of terms that you can possibly get. And so that's what deal advisors do all day, every day, and they have a network that they can lean on to hopefully get you the best price possible.
Downside being the commission.
Downside being the commission, yes.
And I think that it's was one of the errors of the NDA. I'm just going to piggyback to what Melissa said, is that if you don't look at your NDA closely, we've seen circumstances where there are buried standstills sitting in the NDA and you don't even know it. And so you're out and about signing these various NDAs and you think you're kind of shopping your company. And then you find out that because it wasn't your NDA and it wasn't how you wanted it structured, that for a period of 30 days, I don't care if it's 5 hours, if you just thought it was an NDA and now you're supposed to be standing still to give them time, that is a very serious consequence of not knowing your NDA.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I didn't actually mention that when I mentioned NDAs, Melinda, is that sometimes you say you are the seller or whatever, and you have your form of NDA. Sometimes if you're doing a deal with a larger company, they say, no, you take your form and throw it down, flush it down the toilet. You're using our NDA. And so again, it's not just having your legal counsel look at the NDA that you as a company may have drafted. It's if you are being provided with an NDA, you should really be reviewing that as well.
Yeah.
Awesome. I think we've got time for maybe one more question. Heather's asking about share swaps versus cash purchase of shares. Any kind of things to think about in the kind of differences if somebody offers you one or the other, or should you be looking for one or the other? And I think the last to speak was Scott, so I will pass it to Melissa to kind of kick this off if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, for sure. So this is just how you're going to pay the purchase price. Are you going to pay it through for the acquiring company that's paying for the shares? Are you going to pay it with stock or with cash? Often, obviously, a purchaser would love just to get cash and go away. That's not always realistic, though, given the cash resources of the acquirer. So, I guess things to think about: different tax consequences. If you're getting shares in exchange for your shares, you're going to want to hope there's a rollover there, and it might have a better tax consequence than if you got a lump of cash. And obviously the other piece is that you're going to want to know a lot more about the acquiring company. So if they're just going to give you a bunch of cash, do you really care what their company is? Not really. I mean, you might care a little bit for legacy, and you want to make sure it's a good company that's going to take your technology forward. But overall, when you're talking about just the consideration, you get your cash, you go. What happens when you get shares of a company is now you are incredibly invested in that company. You need to know that they're going to succeed. You need to know their management are people you trust to grow the company and to do well. So there's a lot more due diligence the other way. When you're getting shares of a company, you're going to have to do some due diligence on the person acquiring you and the person issuing the shares to you, because you want to know what you're getting into as a shareholder. And depending how many shares you're getting, you might be a very small shareholder, and maybe you don't do that much due diligence because it's Shell and you're going to have less than 1%. But if it's a company where you're going to be a significant shareholder in that company, you're going to want to know a lot about it. And if it's a private company as opposed to a public one, that information is not publicly available. So you're going to have to do a bit more homework. Those are the two sort of big changes that come to mind.
And I guess where, and by the way, if anybody's going to be a 1% shareholder in Shell, I'll be happy to take a ride on your yacht.
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there.
Yeah.
If you are taking shares in a public company, is it common, or in the deals that you've sort of seen, that there's a restriction on your trading? Like you can't trade for 90, 180, 365. Like, so it's not only that the value is coming a different way, but that it's illiquid for a period of time if it's public. And obviously if it's private, it's the liquidity is much harder, right? So that's kind of a concern. But I see Melinda nodding. So yeah, if you're given shares in public companies, usually you're not allowed to go tank their share price the next day by putting hundreds of thousands of units on the market.
Yeah, and philosophically, the exit is so different. As Melissa said, if you get the cash, The company's now in the hands of other people. You've said, I've done what I can do. I've got my cash. I'm either going to do something else or I'm going to leave. If you take shares, private or public, there is a vested interest. And if it's public, as you've mentioned, you're not going to hit the stock as it's trading, but also you want to see it grow. And if you've got a large enough position, you might be negotiating for a board seat. You might be, negotiating for a different standstill or a dribble out, or some kind of vetoes, like you now can't go into strip mining or whatever it is. The relationship with the acquirer is much, much different than if it's just cash. So psychologically, it's a very different goodbye.
Right. Absolutely. All right. We've only got a couple minutes left here, and I believe Astrid has a quick poll. I want to say thank you, obviously, to our panelists, Melinda, Melissa, and Scott, for coming here today and sharing your experience that you've gained over years in this space, over all the deals you've done, some of the things that go right, some of the things that go wrong. I want to say congratulations to all the folks on the line who are actually looking at an exit and thinking this through. For those of you who are in earlier stage, I want to say congratulations for taking the right steps early on to kind of build towards a successful exit and make sure that you're not building in any kind of or burying landmines that are going to be hard to unearth later on. And we will be having another session with BLG in a couple of weeks' time. Let me make sure I get the date right. October 13th at 1 p.m. PST. 1 p.m. Mountain Time. I apologize. 1 p.m. Mountain. On IP, intellectual property, and protecting your intellectual property, the whole life cycle, for when it starts to when you start, using it and showing it to people all the way through. You have to protect that. It is the baby. There is a wonderful slide a colleague of mine shares that about 90% of the value of companies that are publicly traded is intellectual property. Coca-Cola just wouldn't be the same without that red and white can. So intellectual property is where a lot of your value is, and it's so critical to protect. Come on back on October 13th. Thank you very much to everybody who is here today. I had a lot of fun and I learned a few things, so thank you. With that, I think we've got maybe 30, 60 seconds. Any final thoughts from our panelists? Melinda?
Just thank you. This was really a pleasure for us. As I mentioned, when we do this for as long as we do it because we're interested in what clients are doing and what our industry is doing. So we appreciate being invited to this.
Awesome.
Well, thanks so much, and good luck to everyone in their enterprises. And that was really cool to hear a little bit about them. I wish we had more time.
Absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Take care, everybody. Have a great day.